As usual, you have many projects underway. Could you please tell us about the things you're doing that you like most now?
Sure. I think I want to talk about two things: the development of this new global coalition, the Stable Planet Alliance, and why I decided at the age of 60 that I needed to take on a big, overly ambitious new project. And secondly, one of its sub-projects called Girl Planet Earth. And so if it's all right with you, I'll do a couple of minutes just of the sort of circuitous path that I took to get here and why.
Sounds great.
Okay. I think when we spoke before, I told you that I had trained as a global change scientist, but actually originally an evolutionary ecologist and a animal behavior biologist. And those were wonderful and exciting careers that I've tried to morph into my present life. But I went from evolutionary and behavioral ecology into conservation biology, then into global change ecology, the study of, the coupled Earth atmosphere, oceanic systems, and what they can tell us for the future of the planet, and how we as biodiversity scientists need to understand the biosphere side of it, but then also into environmental futures. And all of the 34 years that I was living and working in Southern Africa, having grown up here in the US, but having left pretty early on after high school, I worked most of that time applying science to public policy. So I was, working for the government of Namibia, setting up and running national programs in biodiversity and climate change, and really helping national development planning at the time of Namibia's independence, and then South Africa's post-apartheid transition to democracy. But coming back to the US in 2017, I found that the organizational bases that I had were really just not enough to give me the position or the I suppose the starting point for what I felt I really wanted to do with the rest of my life, which is to grab hold of some of the things that had frustrated me for a long time and try and shift those. And two of those things were human population pressure and human hyperconsumption in this predatory, extractive global economy that we have. There was a time, probably about 15 years ago, where I started to think, all that we're doing as scientists and as project managers to conserve biodiversity and to stop climate change, we're almost pissing into the wind if we can't solve these two problems with population and consumption. And it was some time before I really felt I could step out of those grooves to be able to tackle these two issues directly. But I got the wonderful opportunity this year when I was approached to join a group of a kind of small informal think tank that was trying to reckon with those issues, particularly population. But I felt that we needed to talk about the two together, population and consumption. And that led to me being asked to start up this new alliance, the Stable Planet Alliance. And so that's what I'm doing now. And I can tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. But part of what led to that was the subject that you and I discussed back in 2019, I think it was, or maybe early 2020, when we were talking about the papers that I'd been co-author of, World Scientists Warning of a Climate Emergency. Now, scientists have a long history of shouting into the wind, if not pissing into the wind, excuse my French. But it's rare that we have been really willing to speak up at a level that tries to shake people by the scruff of their neck and say, wake up, we need to do things so differently that you have to be part of it and you're coming along with us, or you'll be left behind. And we are right at the crossroads of our global civilization now, so it's time to pay attention. The 6 issues that we had recommended for urgent global action by humanity in that 2019 paper were energy and atmospheric pollutants like CO2 and carbon soot and methane and hydrofluorocarbons, nature, food systems, population, and the economy. So in other words, hyperconsumption. And it was rare that we talked about population. Most scientists wouldn't even utter the word, and we did. And I felt that I have, responsibility to help take that forward, not only as the only woman on that team of 5 core co-authors of the World Scientists' Warning of a Climate Emergency, but also as the only woman who had been working in national development in developing countries and had a relatively non-academic approach to the issue. So I thought, well, this is my time to get stuck into this, to step up to the plate. So someone had contacted us after that paper within the first few days, and his name was Chris Tucker. Now, Chris Tucker is a geographer and a political scientist, and he's chairman of the American Geographical Society, for example. But he's also a big global geospatial data geek. And he's written a book called Planet of 3 Billion that looks at what the Earth's carrying capacity actually might be and how and why in relation to our ecosystems and our food and water supplies and so on. And Chris Tucker wrote to all 5 of us authors of that paper and said, hey, great, thanks you guys for talking about population. And I think that none of my co-authors responded, but I thought, okay, well, this is a big issue and I do feel strongly about it, but I also, know all of the ins and outs of the politics around the issue. And I've been dealing with that for a very long time. So let me start talking to Chris Tucker. Anyway, to cut a long story short, Chris Tucker and I have started working together. And at one point in our conversation, he said, I'd just be happy to get the conversation going about population. And I thought, well, that's easy. I can do that. In a way, I've been doing it, but now I can really do it. So I started up a Facebook group for women around the world called Population Conversations, which is a closed group. So you probably can't see very far into it yourself, but anyone who's a woman can ask to join it, or a teenage girl, anyone who identifies as a woman. We've got a few non-binary and LGBTQ people who identify as women there. And Population Conversations led to this website called girlplanet.earth. The name was Chris Tucker's idea, but I liked it. It was aimed at a younger audience of women who were just coming into their decision making for their lives. What's their purpose? What's their identity? What's their culture? Are they being pressurized to marry and have kids? What do they want to do? And so we decided just to start collecting women's stories from around the world. And it's been a great experience for us so far. So, it's only a few weeks old, really, maybe 2 months old now. And we've got about, 58 women so far telling from around the world, from about 30 plus countries, from Kosovo to Nigeria to Morocco to Fiji, and women of different ages, from about 18 to, I suppose the oldest woman is probably in her late 70s, talking about their experiences relating to population, consumption, planetary boundaries, and personal choice. And those 4 issues provide this really interesting framework for conversation. And not just those 4 issues, but anything that affects those 4 issues, like culture, politics, economics, faith, family traditions, peer pressure, all those kinds of things. So we don't direct the conversations, we just invite women to submit their story. Short, 120 words to 200 words, somewhere in there, and their picture and what country or countries they identify with. So it's girlplanet.earth on the internet, and it's a great place. And that's kind of grown into the heart of Stable Planet Alliance. So I'll stop there and let you, direct the conversation, but I can tell you more about Stable Planet. I just wanted to give you a pause there.
Could you talk about the link between the population issue and women? I've heard that those two must be addressed together, but I'm not sure I fully understand why.
I think there's been a long and multi-dimensional history of conversation about populations. And it's hardly ever been conversations about women, which is part of the reason why I wanted to step into that space and facilitate it. I have been mentoring and supervising and, basically teaching at universities and the public, women from around the world, and particularly in Africa, for decades. And I know that they have a lot to say, but their voices have not been heard. The history of population discussions has mainly been, and not always for the worse, but occasionally for the worse, driven by older white men from northern countries who recognized the problem. Now, sometimes they had the very best of intentions. Sometimes, perhaps accidentally, perhaps nefariously, they could come across as patriarchal at the least, colonial, racist, culturally arrogant at the worst. And so for about 25, 26, 27 years, there's been a real pushback against that. And so for most of our adult lives, yours and mine, or at least big chunks of it, it's been completely taboo kind of discussion, because women got together along with a bunch of health and education organizations and persuaded the UN through a vehicle called the Cairo Consensus, which I think was back in 1995, that it was important to focus only on women's reproductive health and empowerment. But the whole, and though, let me be clear, those things are incredibly important for changing everything that we need to change on this earth. Those two things are profoundly important. In no way do my comments that follow not imply that. But that whole discussion lost track of the fact that the world's population is still in exponential growth. And the fact that population rates are declining in some wealthy, mainly northern countries, should not distract anyone from that. And there's been a lot of yada yada in the media implying that this is a horrendous crisis for, mainly because of the economy, as though we're all in service to the economy rather than the reverse. Nonetheless, I felt 25 years on after the Cairo Consensus, it's really important to stop that narrative in its tracks and say, okay, yes, let's take these things in service to bending the curve globally on population, and not talk about it as though population is not an issue, because it is. But the other problem is that in recent years, and even among people that should know better, academics, nonprofits, big UN agencies, people have been so reluctant to even utter the P word that they'll say, no, it's not population numbers that are affecting the climate or affecting the planet. It's the wealthy northern lifestyles. And of course it is. It's also that. But you cannot treat one in isolation from the other. You've got to talk about both. Both are problems, and we are way past time that we need to, get together and start discussing them seriously in order to solve them. So, Stable Planet Alliance was set up with the tagline, bending the curve on population and hyperconsumption, because both of these things are critical for decelerating climate change, for stopping biodiversity extinctions, to reduce population and waste and oceanic plastics, and basically every element of global planetary overshoot that we face can be solved through defusing both of these two accelerating drivers of human population and human hyperconsumption. And one last thing that I'd like to say on that, David, is that there's still a lot of people in the North, particularly, who are almost self-censoring about the issue because they want to show that they're being well-meaning about it. And they'll say, no, 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 we can't say anything about it because we're the problem, yes. And the people in the poor North, the people in the poor South, the developing countries, have nothing to do with climate change. It's not their fault, and therefore, therefore, we have to solve the problem. Now, I don't have a problem with most of that statement, except that it's lost touch with reality. Probably 10 or 20 years ago, anybody in the developing world will say, well, yeah, actually, but here in Nigeria, we have multi-billionaires who are, flying to London to go shopping, or, something like that. As we should know, the problem with hyperconsumption is not just in the global North anymore. It's all around the world, particularly in countries like Nigeria, South Africa, Korea, where there's high disparity of wealth. So wealthy, high-consuming individuals, wherever they may be, are the target of where we need to shift the dialogue and shift human values and behaviors. It's not so simple anymore as the global nasty North of rich people and the poor, suffering, starving South. And we need to grasp the world as it is, take collective responsibility. And for sure, the North has historical liability for all the evils of climate change, but solving the problem is just not on the North alone. It requires shifting population and consumption all over the world with a much better approach than has been used in the past.
And what is the approach that the Stable Planet Alliance wants to pursue?
Well, so far, we've identified two very different strategies for getting at this problem. And before I tell you what those are, I just want to remind you of the third word of it, alliance. The alliance will be a coalition of like-minded organizations all around the world that work not only on population and consumerism, for example, but also women's health and education, girls' empowerment, planetary health, biodiversity and conservation, and justice, family planning and fair rights for children. So we will be a broad church of organizations who are working through their own initiatives, but pulling them together to form an unassailable force, maybe I should say an irresistible force, that will change the way things are thought of. But the two very different strategies that we have are top-down and bottom-up. The top-down one is public policy, shifting the Sustainable Development Goals at the UN in their next iteration, which is in 2030. And the Sustainable Development Goals influence national policies all around the world, particularly in developing countries. So we're aiming there first. But at the same time, the bottom-up discussion of shifting public perceptions and narratives through not only issues like vehicles like Girl Planet Earth or the Facebook group called Population Conversations, but also through existing really effective organizations who will be members of our alliance, like, for example, the Population Media Center, which is a wonderful organization that produces culturally, very deeply embedded content, soap operas and radio dramas that help shift cultural norms about right and wrong, about family planning, about talking to, between husbands and wives in very different cultures, from Guatemala to Niger to, Mozambique and Cambodia. So using some of the Alliance members' existing great work to basically tip the curve on both of these issues, public policy and public perception.
I'd like to shift gears a little bit. You are clearly engaged with a worldwide network of scientists and policymakers and educators and a whole group of people who are part of the society, the human society. You are very active yourself. You're engaged with life. There are people watching this video who don't have that access and don't have the feeling that you have of being able to be involved and to put your hands on the problems and solve them. There are people who feel cut off, isolated, they feel despair, they feel grief, they're depressed, they don't know what to do. So from your position as a strong person in the human society, what message do you have for people who don't feel that way?
I think that's probably the most fundamental question, and I'm glad you asked it, because it's easy for me to get carried away with my own momentum and the momentum of my colleagues. I'm surrounded by a few people who have really felt that their energy is depleted by the enormity of what we're all dealing with. And as you know, because I met you in the positive deep adaptation community globally on Facebook, there's a large number of people that come to the deep adaptation community because they feel that they need to seek solace with like-minded people who understand the severity of the problem. I've been working for a long time in two fields that probably no sane person who wants to keep their morale should go into: biodiversity conservation and climate change. And I thank my mother for kind of giving me those inveterately cheerful genes that enable me just to carry on as though we are able to win every battle and ultimately achieve a triumph over the big war. Nonetheless, I would ask people to consider whether their depression is something that they would prefer to be rid of. And I think most people who are depressed are not there by choice. I do know a few people who I think are able to move past a position of nihilism and despair if they feel that there are tangible things that they can contribute to. I've not suffered from any of those, so forgive me for possibly seeming to not understand them well enough. I have relatives who do suffer from depression, so I have some insight into it. And I thank goodness that when I come to my periods of ecological grief, I can have a good cry for about 2 minutes and then I can move on. That's a blessing in these times when you work in my field. I feel that nihilism and fatalism are the worst things that we can wrap ourselves in right now. That they are the other side, in a way, of denialism about climate or the future of the planet, because they lead to inaction. And I don't mean to imply that people always have a choice in this, but I would ask people that feel that they may be able to climb out of it to try again to climb out of it, because nihilism and fatalism are disastrous for our planet. And they are not serving us and our hearts and souls very well either, I think, if most of us are honest about that. I have been, just in the last couple of months, leading a paper of global scientists on a paper called Scientists Warning into Action, from local to global solutions, which talks about the main ways of change that we can move the needle on the climate and the biodiversity crisis by systemic reforms at different levels. Now, some of those 6 areas that we originally identified with the scientists' warning of a climate emergency, energy, atmospheric pollutants, nature, food systems, population, and economy. Not all of those are equally, easy to deal with as individuals or households. But in this new paper, we are looking at 6 scales of action, from the household and individual level, through communities, through cities, through counties and states and provinces. They're called different things in different countries, districts, whatever they may be, through to national to global. And actually, population and consumption, or the economy, are 2 of the most important things that people can deal with in their own lives. And a third is food systems. A lot of people feel disengaged and disempowered by the whole climate change crisis, emergency, because it still seems so abstract. But many of these things are very, very tangible. Many of your listeners or viewers may have started to hear it said that one of the best things that you can do for the climate is to have 1 fewer child. Or if you already have had your children, to make it okay, at least, for your relatives who are younger to not have as many children as you did, or as your parents did, or your grandparents did. Or if they do want to have children, at least encourage them to live more lightly. Each of us exists not as an island, even if we may feel isolated. We are all part of a system, and many of our problems are systemic, and there's a limited amount that we can do individually to change that. But the one thing that most of us in Western democracies can do, obviously, is vote. And another thing that we can all do, even if we're just in an isolated room with a keyboard, we can start the conversation. We can get people talking. We can get out there the idea that the world does not have to be this way. It does not have to end this way. We can change it. We are changing it. And here's what it could look like. I think that scenarios are a very, very powerful motivator for people to make their choices, their behavior changes, because, you know, business as usual is leading us over the cliff. And most of us listening here have known that for a long time. But we're not actually destined to just be lemmings and follow the head lemmings over the cliff. So we identify in this paper a number of a number of solutions at each of those areas, each of those scales, from individual household through to global, that can help bend that curve. And the thing that most people can help with communicating is that there are big changes ahead, and then they don't have to be scary if we are mentally prepared, behaviorally prepared, we're cohesive in our communities to handle them. The transition movement, for example, has, pretty well thought through all the issues of what resilient, cohesive local communities can and should look like. They don't have to be part of this enormous machinery of globalization that gets camembert from France and clothing from China and things from all over the world, that we can relocalize, and that simply the act of relocalizing starts to heal us in all kinds of ways. Not only does it rapidly decelerate our carbon footprint and our overall ecological overshoot footprint, but it just reconnects us to people. It lets us, spend more time doing what we should be doing, and that is, digging in the earth and growing food and repairing creeks and riverine corridors and things like that. Working in the soil is a powerful aid to good mental health. We all know this, or we should know it, that our gut microbiomes, when they are healthy, we start to feel good again. We start to feel that actually we can control our destinies. A lot of depression is closely related to feeling disempowered, but people don't need to feel disempowered anymore. They really don't. We are in a really serious situation. I don't want to make light of it. I'm working with people now that are trying to develop technologies to oxidize methane from the atmosphere, so that we've got multiple layers of insurance from these big cataclysmic curveballs that could hit us because of our complacency and inaction of past decades. So I'm very aware of it. Maybe I'm just destined to be someone who, is playing the fiddle as everybody gets into the lifeboats on the Titanic. But nonetheless, I don't buy into the idea that anything is served by nihilism or despair. And particularly the other thing that I want to say about that, what isn't served is our children and the next generation. They are not served by a bunch of older people sitting around saying, oh my God, we're doomed. They need to have agency and capacity and inspiration to get on with their future.
I am very glad that there are people like you who are genetically predisposed to fight and fight until the end. So thank you for that. Phoebe, thank you so much for your time. Your projects are fascinating. I know I will look into them. Could you say the names again?
The main global coalition is called the Stable Planet Alliance. It actually does not even have a website yet. It's so new. I'm trying to find time to finish it. The projects that I mentioned are girlplanet.earth and the Facebook group Population Conversations. So those two are particularly targeted to women and teenage girls. And I would like to invite any women and teenage girls listening to this to please join us there and send us your story or post in the Facebook group. I do want to say as one last thing, David, that having these conversations with women is only one tiny early part of the story. The conversations need to be very much among men. And of course, they need to be among people without reference to gender. But the reason that we start with women is that so much about population and consumption is tied into men's sense of wealth and status and ego. And so navigating the sexual politics of family planning and alternative purposes in life is a really treacherous landscape that a lot of women have to navigate, not only with their husbands or boyfriends, but with their fathers and men leaders in their communities. So we wanted to give a safe space for women, but I am lighting little fires, and other people are lighting little fires all over the globe to get men talking about population and conversation too.
Thank you for that. It's been wonderful to talk to you, and I look forward to the next time, whenever that may be. Thank you.
It's always a privilege, David. You're an absolute star. Thank you so much for inviting me.